In our last video, the Aga Khan had mentioned the acceleration of the construction of civil society. The statement is unsettling to say the least, as it relates to the breakdown of our governments. Civil society attempts to replicate our national institutions, with a communist structure emphasizing voluntary responsibility, versus a service-driven economy that is based on a mutually beneficial trade arrangement. These institutions were founded and maintained by our governments and us as community members alike, with responsibilities delegated on mutual benefit and not forced obligation. I think a deeper understanding as to what exactly civil society is and what role does it play within a given nation, society, and community.
That there's been a movement away in terms of real leadership from governments to almost private foundations, philanthropic organizations, yours being one, and the Gates Foundation, and you can name a number. Bono, the singer. Do you see that happening? Is that a good thing?
I see it happening, and I welcome it wholeheartedly, because what we're talking about, I think, is accelerating the construction of civil society.
Civil society, what is it and what function does it serve? As stated by the United Nations, civil society is the third sector of society, along with the government and business. It comprises civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations.
By civil society, I mean an array of institutions that operate on a private, voluntary basis, but are motivated by high public purposes. They include institutions devoted to culture, to science, and to research, to commercial, labor, ethnic, and religious concerns, as well as a variety of professional societies.
Civil society is a result of.
I think the more we've seen societies which are fractured, putting little groups of people in another box, that is a way of guaranteeing conflict and poverty.
Governments cannot deal with the current financial crisis on their own and need the support of the people they govern, which is best translated by the opinions of the civil society movement. Governments do not have sufficient strength on their own and must take into account the thinking of their own people as translated by civil society.
Through non-profit, private organizations, what we call today civil society.
These crises will not go away overnight, but they cannot be attacked without having civil society on board. Civil society. It sounds like a basic democratic structure, in so much that the members of a given society place their grievances, and such grievances are heard by the elected body, which decides on an appropriate action. But what is concerning is that governments collect taxes, and those taxes are then used to manage and develop society, in parallel with private industry. So why is civil society required?
Civil society has three critical underpinnings: a commitment to pluralism, an open door to meritocracy, and a full embrace of what I described earlier as a cosmopolitan ethic.
But more to the point, with third-party intervention like civil society, whose voice is it that gets heard? And what is the speaker's intention? Civil society can be summed up as an NGO, which leads us to the question, what is an NGO? The NGO is a non-governmental organization. Its funds are raised by the government, but it maintains a non-governmental position. With no need for a government council, they are also known as a civil society organization. It's interesting to say the least that governments raise the funds necessary for NGOs, instead of these governments simply delegating these funds to local communities as prescribed in taxation breakdowns. It's at this point that a distinction needs to be made, that being an NGO is not a non-for-profit. As you will come to see, these organizations work synergistically, marching towards a common goal. Nonprofit organizations are service organizations or charities that are established for cooperative, trust, or purely informal reasons.
And so our network grew. Today, it embraces a group of agencies, non-governmental and non-dominational, operating in 35 countries. They work in fields ranging from education, medical care, to job creation and energy production, from transport and tourism to media and technology, from the fine arts and cultural heritage to banking and microfinance. But they're all working together toward a single, overarching objective.
NGOs serve as an executive branch for NPOs. NGO members double as NPO board members and/or controlling members or even associates. The NGOs supply the funds and establish the strategies for the NPOs to put into action.
We learn to work with effective partners, including the not-for-profit institutions of civil society.
NGOs are categorized based on function, and it is this function of resource management which positions them as the executive arm of NPOs. Why do NGOs exist, and what do they really offer a society?
The Archon Development Network embraces many facets and functions. But if we're trying to sum up in a single word its central objective, I would focus on the word opportunity.
NGOs are non membership support organizations involved in relief, rehabilitation, or community development. Considered a part of the civil arena in society, which also includes trade unions, people's associations, and membership organizations, as well as cooperatives and religious based charities.
His Highness has made every sector and aspect of the human existence a part of his concern. Today, it constitutes one of the world's largest non-governmental development agencies.
NGOs provide a third approach to development between market-led and state-led strategies. Development-oriented NGOs are not simply located somewhere between state and market in terms of institutional space, but are emerging as a critical third or middle sector, fostering the development of marginalized segments of the population. NGOs as the only alternative to promote grassroots development.
Network is that it's not a banking system in the sense that the network commits without time limit to the processes of change.
Most of the multilateral banks, the United Nations, USAID, and advocacy organizations in the United States and Europe favor a restructuring of aid away from traditional government-to-government approaches towards people-to-people programs. The new objectives of the development models can be achieved much more cost-effectively through NGOs. This is primarily because NGOs tend to be a flexible vehicle for meeting a variety of human needs, including self-expression or empowerment, promoting equity, self-help, participation, and mutual assistance.
The network is a multi-input system. We'd like to impact areas of Syrian development, not just one. And therefore we're looking at support in education, we're looking at support in healthcare, we're looking at support in economic development, we're looking at support in cultural development.
NGOs exist to render the work of civil society. As claimed, civil society is the process in which the volunteer efforts of the community members seek to assist the marginalized and less fortunate. Sounds like a great idea. To replace paid services with voluntary actions really gives it a communist feel. This communist feeling should worsen when you realize that NGOs invest exclusively into marginalized groups. Now we have to consider that an investment into the marginalized is also an investment into counterculture.
This marginalization is so structured in society that minorities find it very difficult to break out of that situation.
Because of targeting and being responsive to marginalized groups in society, NGOs are being heralded as important vehicles for empowerment, democratization, and economic development. In fact, some NGOs are being driven by strong values and interests, geared toward empowering communities that have traditionally been disempowered.
Of marginalization that you speak of,
Right.
that are divisive in so many ways.
Right.
It is these groups' failure to integrate into the dominant culture which has defined them as marginalized. And an investment in such groups is to venture in cultural and societal destruction. If the goal is cultural replacement, and the NGOs are the executive branch of the operations put forth by NPOs, we need to ask what function do they offer to a given nation and society? Does it strengthen a society through stability, or is it merely there to disrupt and replace?
Centrifugal forces in our time, the forces of fragmentation. These forces, I believe, can threaten the coherence of democratic societies and the effectiveness of democratic institutions.
Now that we have a better understanding as to the role and function of NGOs, as well as the synergistic relationship they share with NPOs as a labor force and action potential, the organization's from executive through to operations role is to offer relief, rehabilitation, and community development. Now, if we direct our attention to present day application, the challenge seems to be in separating the concept of assistance from the concept of disruption, with disruption seeking conquest and replacement as its goal.
Now, that issue of accepting pluralism also means that you need to attach equity to that notion. If there is no equity in pluralist societies, then you don't have functioning pluralist societies, you don't have institutions that function properly.
People who are counterculture and have the ambition to disrupt society seem to be the marginalized that the NGOs are in search of. Now you have to wonder if NGOs, and to a greater extent NPOs' role is disruption. Are they acting in a conquest capacity? And if so, who is the authoritative body?
Who's showing leadership?
I think there are a number of people in the UN system who've shown leadership, who have shown balanced judgment on these issues, because when all is said and done, it's the balance of the judgment that counts, and it's understanding the issue.
We have to keep in mind that NGOs funding comes from governments. And who is the largest body who acts in the interests of cooperative governance? The United Nations. The larger foundations, such as the Aga Khans, the Clintons, the Fords, and the Gates, are not even listed on the United Nations membership list. As it turns out, the title foundation is nothing more than marketing. And in fact, they are registered as an NGO. So why is it that the foundations wouldn't be registered on the United Nations membership list? Could it be that the foundations are integrated directly in the United Nations? Non-government organization, NGO. Are they attempting to replace our government?
I think you will see governments fail because they do not practice this principle. They will have so many divisions within them, so many attempts at achieving positions of power by certain groups or influenced by others, that it will be impossible to create a sense of nationhood, a sense of building around common values, which after all is what most governments would wish to have.
We never see the third world poor rise out of poverty. Rather, we see greater levels of poverty in the first. NGOs aid, based on present application, seems to be prioritized towards the first world. Which leads to the question, what development is taking place in the first world? Kenya, Zambia, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and Namibia, and South Africa. These are all countries which have been overtaken by NGOs, and are also countries that the Aga Khans heavily invested in, from media and renewable energies to agriculture and finance. What I find most unsettling is the fact that our acts of goodwill and charity seem to be used against us. And even more troubling is the fact that the groups that our goodwill has been directed towards seem to have been weaponized. Now let's take a look at the NPOs who represent the marginalized, the investment of the NGOs. Let's see how they've contributed to the betterment of society. The LGBT, attempting to destroy Christianity, the foundation of Western culture. BLM, disrupting security and policing, that which keeps us safe. Feminism, destroying the family. the death of the next generation. The interesting thing here is that as Christianity breaks down, it seems that it is being replaced by Islam. And oddly enough, he who is the primary investor in the marginalized is none other than the Aga Khan, an Islamic leader.
Also trying to work with young people in various areas, just tell to them, create according to your own value system. You don't have to copy other people's value systems. Modernization does not mean Occidentalization.
Under the new policy agenda, NGOs are seen as vehicles for democratization as well as for providing goods and services. Donor agencies now favor new and innovative development strategies, such as the minimalist, cost-effective approach used by microfinancing institutions, assisted self-reliance, or participatory development.
We found that this whole area of microfinance, which in simple terms is lending on trust,
That's right.
is an extraordinarily powerful way to support poor people in many, many different ways, because it can be for education, it can be for healthcare, it can be for cultural rehabilitation, it can be for commerce. There are practically no limits.
NGOs appear well suited to adapt the use of new and innovative strategies because of their small scale, flexibility, and wide-ranging capacity to mobilize resources and to organize people to solve their own problems.
Private initiative, and not necessarily initiative for profit, just private initiative, civil society.
Civil society, the private industry masquerading as institution, sitting between government and industry, and its position is founded on the greatest contradiction.
In fact, neuroscientists are saying that newly born children recognize the pluralism of other children being next to them in a cot, even if they can't see the child. Mm-hmm. So the individual, the human individual, has extraordinary means of sensing somebody who is from a different society.
Our tolerance and acceptance results from the notion that there is no difference amongst people, and that differences are merely socially constructed.
Pluralism is a subject that is taught. It's not instinctive in human society.
If this is true, then it is safe to assume that there is a tolerance curve threshold, and if so, our threshold is being continuously pushed by NGOs. Might it be to challenge our identity and convictions?
Reaching out, I think especially of the Amman Declaration that you were part of,
Right.
and of the message that was delivered called A Common Word between us and you, from so many Muslim leaders to Christian leaders.
How ironic is it that an attempt at theological unity stems from the concept of commonality, considering the same approach of oneness was used by Muhammad when he positioned the notion of Abrahamic faiths, eliminating any doubt in him as a prophet.
Jewish, Christian, and Muslim societies all are founded on theological principles that stress the oneness of God.
We just listened to the greatest contradiction of all time, and it is this idea of pluralism that has been used to defraud and disadvantage the West, rooted in the Christian principle of oneness.
Each of us and all of us, born of a single soul.
And the greatest concern is that the universal single soul within the Abrahamic faiths may consolidate the Judeo-Christian tradition to Islam.
And what would happen, and I'm sorry to come back to this, but it's important, if a Muslim army went into Northern Ireland and replaced one Christian interpretation by another? Imagine the fallout that that would cause in the Christian world itself.
Syria, the root of the immigration crisis, and North Africans invading, a geographic area which the Aga Khan has great influence and control over.
Islam expanded out of Arabia. One of its first areas of interfacing with non-Muslim societies was in Syria. and it was the first contact between the Muslim world and an established Judeo-Christian society. It was the East Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire. So historically, Syria was one of the very earliest situations in which Islam came into contact with non-Islamic established societies. So it's one of our earliest case studies. Historically, Syria was one of the very earliest situations in which Islam came into contact with non-Islamic established societies. So it's one of our earliest case studies.
Syria. Is it even safe for Christians to live there? How did the theological partnership turn out?
Always easier to unite followers in a negative cause than a positive one. But the consequences can be a perilous polarization.
The illustrious words of the Aga Khan. If you don't know the issues or the forces at play, the ability to predict is seriously constrained.
The invasion of Iraq was something which has mobilized what we call the Ummah, that is, the community of Muslims around the world. Every Muslim that I have ever talked to has felt engaged by this. In my view, the deeper problem behind any prospective clash of civilizations is a profound clash of ignorances. And in that struggle, education will be an indispensable weapon.
The art of war and conquest has 3 stages. First is to infiltrate, second is to invade, and the final stage is conquer. An example of infiltration is affirmative action.
Sometimes problems or the need to create change will take 15 or 20 years.
Invasion can be seen in Europe's migrant crisis.
The developing world of Asia, Africa, the Middle East.
Germany is generous towards the developing world. It analyzes the problems and seeks solutions very much in the same direction as we are ourselves. They're covering more and more fields, including culture. So that's where we're working together. And through Germany, we're also working with the European Union.
And last but not least, conquest. Release the barbarians.
Where you were warning the West that it had to do a better job in trying to understand Islam.
As you know, I was born into a Muslim family, linked by heredity to the Prophet Muhammad.
Established by the Aga Khan to realize, quote, the social conscience of Islam through institutional action, unquote.
Fully 37 countries have been writing or rewriting their constitutions in the last 10 years, with another 12 countries recently embarking on this path. This means that nearly 25% of the member countries of the United Nations have been rethinking these central governance concerns. And nearly 49 of these countries have majority Muslim populations. And the new world order that it promised. I think the conclusion is that the success of democratic societies will depend in the end on more than democratic governments. The scale and the quality of civil society will become a factor, I believe, of enormous importance.
Like, share, and subscribe. Click that notification button and check us out on social media. Links are in the description below.